So I wanted to get to know you all a little bit better, and so I just have a simple question. What is your favorite Disney movie? And you can just shout some of them out. I need your help. Beauty and the Beast, I hear. That's a good one. Anything else? Young people? Little Mermaid, good one. Mulan, I heard maybe? No? Okay, good. There's some great Disney movies, aren't there? The music is amazing. So to get to know me a little bit better, I had two favorite Disney movies growing up. The first was The Lion King, because I was a really big fan of Home Improvement, specifically Jonathan Taylor Thomas, who was the voice of Simba. And my second was The Little Mermaid, because the music is just fantastic. Now, admittedly, as an adult, I struggle a little bit with the plot of The Little Mermaid. Don't love the whole you have to change all of who you are for a man, but the music, the music has remained a highlight. It is a good, it's just a great score. And as I was reading through our passage of scripture for this morning, a line from The Little Mermaid just continued to come to my mind. Now, even though the movie is like 30 years old and it came out when I was a kid, I promise not to spoil the ending for you if you haven't quite gotten it to it yet. But I was reminded of a scene in The Little Mermaid where Ariel comes face to face with Ursula, the sea monster, and Ursula presents a plan for Ariel to become human. And Ariel's kind of grappling with this need to choose either being with her father and her sisters and her friends under the sea, or a chance to find true love with Prince Eric on dry land. And Ursula says this: life's full of tough choices, isn't it? Life is full of tough choices. Now, realistically, life is made up of all kinds of choices. Some of them are just tiny, inconsequential, like what outfit to wear for the day, or whether to have strawberries or bananas in a smoothie. We make the choice of what route to take to school or to the office, or what sitcom to watch at the end of a long day, what book to read during our spare time. But we also have these kind of giant choices that we must make in our lives. We choose where to go to school, what post-secondary program to take, what companies to apply for, what jobs to take. We choose our friends, we choose our partners, we choose what church to go to, we choose where to live, and the list goes on and on. Life's full of tough choices, isn't it? As I read our passage of scripture, we are met once again with our friends, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, and the teachers of the law. And if you were here a couple of weeks ago, or if you joined us online, you may remember when we looked into the conversation that Jesus had with the paralyzed man, and of course, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the religious leaders. If you remember that week, or even if you don't, I will just say once again that Jesus and the religious leaders had a very tumultuous relationship in the Gospels. And the fact is, they often made the choice to seek Jesus out, to challenge him, to challenge Jesus' teachings. This is what they do in our conversation with Jesus from this week. They challenge him, and they try to force him to make a choice in how to respond to the woman they place before him. Our text begins at dawn, where we find Jesus has gone to the temple courts. This is the very beginning of the day, and the religious leaders are already choosing to challenge Jesus as he is teaching those who have gathered around him. The temple courts would have been a place of Jewish national, social, and religious life. So this location would be very important. And whether it was by design or simply because that is where the people gathered, it presents Jesus as an authority. It places Jesus as a prominent and important figure in the temple, that he would teach at this location. As you can suspect, this did not sit right with the religious leaders. In fact, this infuriated the religious leaders. They would feel threatened by his very presence in the temple, let alone the audacity he had to teach in the temple courts. And yet, this is where we find Jesus. In the temple courts, with a group of people gathered around, and Jesus doing what Jesus does best, meeting with the people and teaching the people. It is often when Jesus is in the middle of teaching that the religious leaders choose to approach Jesus. It is often when Jesus is surrounded by people that they choose to challenge him and try to force him to make a statement or take action regarding whatever it is they are presenting him with. On this day, the religious leaders come to Jesus with a woman. "Teacher," they say, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery." You see, this wasn't simply a woman who was known as being adulterous. This wasn't simply a woman who had been adulterous in the past. This was a woman who was caught in the very act of adultery, seemingly on that day by the religious leaders. And the religious leaders made a choice on that day to focus on the woman. Now, we all know it takes two people to commit adultery. And yet only the woman is standing before Jesus. It is only the woman who is given the title of adulterous woman. It is only the woman put on display in front of a crowd. It is only the woman being used as a prop to challenge and trap Jesus. It is only the woman standing in the middle of the temple courts in what I can only imagine as some degree of undress, with her heart racing and blood rushing to her cheeks, not knowing if stones would be hurled at her body until eventually it went lifeless. It is only the woman forced to endure the humiliation at the hands of a group of respected men. The men in the story, the religious leaders, choose to use the woman in their plot to trap Jesus with no regard for her life, no thought of her well-being, and certainly with no intention of witnessing the hope of redemption. The religious leaders have made a series of choices that brought them to the temple courts on this day. And I believe they came to that place already choosing to pick up the stones and hold them in their hands. It says in verse 5, in the law of Moses, he commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? Scripture also tells us, the reader, that the purpose of this question was to trap Jesus. Their motives certainly weren't pure, just to uphold the laws. They were going after Jesus. But I would venture a guess that those standing around the temple courts around Jesus, they weren't privy to this information. For those standing around, this came from well-respected religious leaders, and they are pointing them to the words of Moses. They are pointing them to Leviticus 20 and 10 that does condone the punishment of death for the crime of adultery. Now, what the crowd may be overlooking is the inconsistency between what the religious leaders are saying and what is actually found in Scripture, because in the law, it states that the punishment is not only for the woman, but also for the man. That's nowhere to be found. The religious leaders have made a choice on that day. They have made several choices, in fact. They chose to pick up the stones when they ripped her away from the arms of the adulterous man as they devised this plan to trap Jesus. They chose to pick up the stones when they walked her through the temple courts without her consent. They chose to pick up the stones when they made her stand before a group of people, stand before Jesus. They chose to pick up those stones when they prompted the punishment should be death. They chose to pick up those stones when they continue to choose judgment over grace and condemnation over redemption. Over and over and over again, the religious leaders are choosing the stones. Perhaps at times you can relate to the woman in the story. I'm not necessarily talking about adultery. Perhaps you can relate to the woman in the story because you have felt judgmental eyes cast in your direction. Perhaps you have been metaphorically paraded through the temple courts and placed in front of a crowd and felt the condemnation rather than the hope of redemption. Perhaps at a time in your life when you needed to feel overwhelming grace, you have received nothing but judgment. I have shared parts of my story before, but I can't help but be reminded of a specific time in my life where I have been on the receiving end of judgment when what I needed desperately was grace from fellow Christians. I was a hurting 22-year-old when I found myself to be single and pregnant with my now oldest Malachi. Don't get me wrong, I was well supported by family and friends. But there were times as my pregnant belly grew bigger when I would hear the whispers in the foyer after a Sunday morning service. There were times when a Christian brother or sister would look me right in my eyes and say incredibly hurtful things to my face. Moments in my life when I felt the stones being picked up right in front of me. Perhaps there are moments in your life where you have felt the same thing. The circumstances may be different than the woman's, may be different than mine, but perhaps there are chapters in your life story where people have chosen to pick up the stones and to write your name on it. Perhaps there are moments in your life when people have chosen to judge rather than to offer grace, when Christian brothers and sisters have already condemned you and laughed at you at the thought of redemption. Oh, Father, forgive them for picking up the stones. But maybe, just maybe, the person you relate to in this conversation is the religious leaders. It's an uncomfortable thought, isn't it? That perhaps we, a time or two in our lives, have been just like the religious leaders in someone else's story. Of course, none of us strive to be like the religious leaders, but perhaps a couple of times we've picked up some stones. Is it possible? Is it possible that at times we have been just like the religious leader in someone else's story? Whispering behind someone's back, spreading rumors about someone who is hurting, choosing to condemn rather than hope for redemption, judgment winning out over grace. Perhaps at times we have shown up with stones in hand, ready to throw them. Oh, Father, forgive me. Forgive us for those stones that have been found in our hands. The religious leaders had a choice to make. They chose the stones. But Jesus also had a choice to make, and not to jump ahead or spoil anything, but of course Jesus didn't choose the stones, because when it comes to stones, they roll away in front of Jesus. Even when the religious leaders attempted to persuade him by quoting scripture, even when he was badgered, Jesus never chose the stones. The religious leaders have just approached Jesus in all their piety and superiority. They have come with the woman in tow and placed her in front of Jesus, in front of the crowd. They have pled their case. They have provided references for what they believe is supposed to happen. They have made this big spectacle in the temple courts. But Jesus doesn't join in. Oh no. Jesus doesn't even begin by challenging the religious leaders. Jesus doesn't ask his own question. Jesus remains calm. He bends down. He makes no eye contact with them. He says nothing, and he just starts to write in the sand with his finger. He basically makes the choice to ignore the religious leaders. There are many times in Scripture that I just want more information, and this is one of those times. Because I want to know what Jesus is writing. What is he writing in that sand? And theologians for years have speculated on what it could be. It could be that Jesus is writing the name of those that are found in the crowds. It could be that he's just doodling, just passing time, like some people do during sermons, right? They're just doodling, trying to pay attention. I get it, I'm with you. Others suggest that, and this one is my favorite, that perhaps Jesus is literally writing out the sins of the religious leaders, saying, this person, this is their sin. Could you imagine if that's what it was, how the religious leaders were feeling? The reality is we just don't know. I can suggest that perhaps Jesus just needed a minute to collect himself. It is first thing in the morning, and the religious leaders are coming to him and badgering him. Perhaps he just needed a minute to remember this wasn't the time for table flipping Jesus. This is the time for Jesus to be gentle, albeit impactful and firm. And so in those moments, Jesus chooses the sand over the stones. Of course, the religious leaders do not accept being ignored. Of course, the religious leaders demand a response to their question. How will they trap Jesus if he isn't even willing to engage with them? If he simply chooses to ignore them? Of course they don't accept this. They insist that he answer them and take the woman's life into his hands. Verse 7 says this, when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And then once again, he bends down, stops interacting, and chooses the sand once again. I love so many things about Jesus, but this is just perfection. If Jesus was using a mic, it would be the mic drop moment, wouldn't it? The religious leaders intended to trap Jesus, it says in verse 6. This is the trap they intended Jesus to fall into. You see, they believed that Jesus had two choices and only two choices. The first would be to disregard the laws of Moses, but that would mean the Jewish people would view him as a lawbreaker and as a person who disregards the will of God. He loses credibility with the people. The second option is that Jesus would choose the stones and had her sentenced to death. But this would mean his ministry would be inconsistent. His ministry has been about circulating amongst sinners and not only treating them as valuable and worthwhile, but offering forgiveness and redemption from their lives of sin. If he chose this, he would again lose credibility with the people. We have to give it to the religious leaders. It is a good plan for another, but not when dealing with Jesus. They didn't see that there was a third option that Jesus was about to take. Because as is often the case, in the plans of the religious leaders, they often will grossly underestimate Jesus. And not only does Jesus not fall into their trap, but he finds a way to turn it around on them. Jesus' infamous words in verse 7, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her, are filled with a giant weight placed on the shoulders of the religious leaders. You see, first, these words are reminiscent of the laws of Moses. Deuteronomy 17:7 tells us that the witnesses are the first in putting a person to death. So this would be on them to begin. Second, the religious leaders are not able to find a third option like Jesus was. They had to choose between picking up the stones, and they seemed desperate to do this. But now, that would mean making a big statement that they were without sin. The consequences of that decision would be the people in the crowd, the other religious leaders scrutinizing their claims of being without sin. Really? You think you have no sin? Or the second choice, to walk away and admit they failed once again in trapping Jesus, but more importantly, admit publicly that they too were sinful. Life's full of tough choices, isn't it? Jesus very clearly chooses the sand over the stones. He says, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Once again, he bends down and he writes in the sand. When it came to stones or sand, Jesus chooses the sand. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Jesus doesn't condone adultery or any other kind of sin in a person's life. In fact, Jesus gives a final instruction to the woman to leave her life of sin. Jesus wants more for the woman than how she's been living. And we see this when Jesus says in the beginning of verse 11, "Then neither do I condemn you." Because for Jesus, this isn't a story of condemnation. This is a story of hope for redemption. It seems like for Jesus, in the choice of the stones versus the sand, it wasn't such a tough choice after all. At times, we are faced with this same choice in our lives, aren't we? At times, people are brought before us, and others are asking us to condemn, are asking or expecting us to choose the stones. And our passage of scripture is dealing with the adulterous woman, but this woman can represent any number of people and any number of situations that have been placed before us. Any number of situations that society or the church or people in general would like to condemn. Any number of people with sin in their lives or perceived sin in their lives. And we are faced with the same choice, the stones or the sand. We are followers of Jesus Christ. We are not followers of the religious leaders. We're not even followers of the church. We are to model our lives after Jesus' life. And so in the choice of the stones or the sand, we must always choose the sand. We must always choose as Jesus did. And I know that some would respond, but if I know that others are living in sin, don't I need to point it out to them? And I do think that there is a time and a place for this. There's scripture passages that talk about this. But it should never be done publicly. It should always be done with sensitivity. And it should never be done in a spirit of judgment or condemnation. And truthfully, I am a firm believer, I am firm in my belief that when we stand before God, He will not condemn us for erring on the side of too much grace. He will not condemn us for loving His people too much. He will not condemn us for striving for the redemption story over the condemnation story. He will not condemn us for choosing grace over judgment. He will not condemn us for choosing the sand over the stones. Friends, we, like Jesus, can and should choose the sand. We, like Jesus, can choose gentleness and grace and an abundance of love. We, like Jesus, can choose to look into the eyes of God's beloved children and choose to see the possibility of a redemption story rather than a condemnation story. But to do that, we must put down the stones. Let's bow in prayer.